On August 17, 1994, in the quiet American town of Cedar Ridge, police discovered two bodies, a man and a teenager. There was a large amount of blood in the living room, and traces of his father's DNA, his semen, were found on the teenager's hands. The mother sat in the kitchen with bloody hands, silent. The Milton family lived in a small one-story house on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, Indiana. The house stood on a quiet street called West Deer Lane, where neighbors knew each other by name, and children played in the yards in the evenings. However, house number 74 was considered special, not because of its appearance, but because of those who lived inside. The family's father, Kevin Milton, 32, suffered from Treacher syndrome from birth, a rare genetic disorder that left him with severe facial deformities, sunken cheeks, underdeveloped cheekbones, and deformed ears. He was unable to hold down open positions, leading to long periods of unemployment. Several years ago, he tried to get a job at an auto repair shop, but quit after just a few days, according to colleagues, due to excessive attention and jokes. Linda Milton, his wife, worked as a nurse at the city hospital. She was known for her reserved and hardworking personality, but colleagues recalled that in recent years, something heavy had developed within her. Linda often stayed late at work, avoided conversations about her family, and reacted withdrawnly to any mention of her husband. The family had two children, Aaron, 15, and Emily, 9. Both attended the local school, but Aaron in particular was often bullied. His classmates teased him about his father's appearance, which made the teenager aggressive and withdrawn. Teachers noted his sudden mood swings, but his parents refused to attend meetings with the school psychologist. Neighbors recalled that the family was rarely involved in neighborhood life. They weren't seen at holidays, their children didn't come to parties, and the windows of the house were often curtained even during the day. Kevin left the house only for short walks with the dog and returned quickly without looking around. Several times, neighbors spotted the boy accompanying him, but there was no usual childish liveliness between them. They walked silently, at the same pace, as if obeying some internal routine. According to medical records, Kevin did not suffer from mental disorders, but he did exhibit increased anxiety and signs of depression. Linda consulted her family doctor in 1992 with complaints of insomnia, irritability, and anxiety, but declined further evaluation. Over time, the Milton home became a closed-off space, with everyone living separately. Linda slept in the living room, explaining that her husband snored too loudly. Aaron often slept in his room with the door closed. Emily, according to her teacher, was a quiet and timid girl who rarely made eye contact. In 1993, the family changed churches, where they had previously attended regularly. The pastor recalled that in recent months, Kevin began avoiding socializing even after services. He sat in the back row and left first without saying goodbye. The situation inside the house remained tense. Linda worked nights, leaving her husband with the children. Neighbors noticed lights often left on late in the evenings, and voices were sometimes heard. The police were called several times because of loud noises, but the officers who arrived found no violations. The family opened the door each time, insisting everything was fine. School reports indicate that in early 1994, Aaron stopped attending basketball and spent all his time at home. His behavior became increasingly irritable. Teachers noted an anxious attachment to his father and frequent conversations about illness and injustice. When a social worker offered the family counseling, Linda declined, stating that they didn't want the attention. According to the psychologist, the family exhibited signs of social isolation, characteristic of closed households, where internal connections become the only source of emotional experience. Under such conditions, the report noted, the boundaries between family members gradually blur. Photographs from that time show the family trying to appear normal. Group shots from local fairs and school events showed an outward calm. But even then, according to investigators, what would later be called psychological decay was building inside the house. By mid-1994, Kevin had stopped going outside altogether. Linda brought him food into his room, and only Aaron stayed with him for hours. Neighbors said his mother increasingly yelled at her son, who responded with silence. No one suspected that in this silence, disaster was brewing. By the spring of 1994, Aaron was spending more and more time in his father's room. At first, it was out of concern. He helped him eat, brought him water, moved his chair, and made sure Kevin took his medication. Gradually, these visits became longer. The rest of the family became accustomed to the fact that the door to his father's room was almost always closed. Even during the day, sounds were rarely heard from behind it. School teachers noted that Aaron's behavior had begun to change. He stopped interacting with his classmates, showed no interest in lessons, and drawings of mask-like faces appeared in his notebooks. The school psychologist's notes included notes about an unnatural fixation on appearance and ugliness. The psychologist recommended additional observation, but the family declined visits. According to the investigation, it was during this period that a dependence developed between father and son, which experts would later call an emotional fusion. Kevin needed approval and understanding, which he didn't receive from his wife, while the teenager needed acceptance and empathy. Both found this in each other, but the bonds formed in isolation quickly took a pathological form. According to neighbors, the boy stopped appearing outside. He was often seen only in the evenings, taking out the trash or getting the mail. He was noted to have become more attentive to his appearance, mimicking his father, wearing loose shirts, lowering his head when speaking, and sometimes mimicking his manner of speech. This behavior was considered a desire for identification, but investigators' reports would later refer to it as symbiotic attachment. Linda tried to limit their interactions. She changed their daily routine and asked her son to spend more time with his sister, but her words had no effect. Any attempts to intervene irritated him. Witnesses observed a growing atmosphere of hidden confrontation in the home. The mother spent more and more time away from home, while the father and son led separate, withdrawn lives. In June, Aaron stopped sleeping in his room. According to forensic experts, the sheets later found on his bed hadn't been used for several weeks. The items had been moved to his father's bedroom, indicating the teenager had been there regularly. 2 glasses would later be found on shelves in that room, matching a collection of personal items, toothbrushes, towels, and clothing. The investigation established that it was during this period that intimate relationships began to develop. This was confirmed by entries from the teenager's diary found during the search. The entries were chaotic, but they suggested that the boy perceived his relationship with his father as special and non-negotiable. Doctors involved in analyzing the materials noted signs of delusional idealization and a loss of personal boundaries. Neighbors reported screams coming from the house at night. Police responded twice, in July and early August, but each time Aaron answered the door and insisted all was well. The patrol officer's report states that the boy appeared tense and refused to let them in, citing his father's illness. Experts later concluded that a closed system had formed within the family, where father and son existed as a single unit, while mother and daughter were external elements, excluded from emotional exchange. Kevin was completely dependent on his son's attention, and Kevin perceived him as the center of his own existence. Linda felt a loss of control and increasingly complained to colleagues about another presence in the house, although she didn't specify what she meant. At the end of July, Aaron stopped showing up at school. The teachers filed a report with social services, but due to bureaucratic delays, the investigation never took place. Meanwhile, the shutters of the Milton home were seen closed even during the day. Neighbors reported a growing sense of unease. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and the second-story windows were taped over from the inside with thick paper. When investigators later reconstructed the chronology of events, they would call this period a temporal threshold, after which the family completely lost contact with the outside world. Inside the house, only their closed circle existed, where normal moral and psychological norms ceased to apply. In this state of isolation, Kevin and Aaron created their own system of relationships, without boundaries, without control, without fear of judgment. By August 1994, the concept of personal space no longer existed between them. They ate together, slept in the same room, and spent all their time together. The daughter lived separately with relatives, but the mother still remained in the house. According to the investigation, she perceived what was happening as something painful but irreversible. It was during these weeks that the mother's anxiety began to turn into despair. Her behavior became unpredictable, and the tension in the house, precursor to disaster, became increasingly apparent. August 1994 marked the last month of the Milton family's existence in its familiar form. The house, which had recently echoed with the television and children's footsteps, became a closed-off zone where every object, from the light switch to the door, began to lose its usual meaning. Linda no longer tried to talk to her husband and son. She simply observed. According to investigators during this period, both men's behavior became unusual. and frightening. Kevin only left his room at night, avoiding light. His movements were accompanied by muffled furniture sounds, as if he were moving things aimlessly. The son rarely left the house, remaining in constant proximity to his father. Both men were later found with identical abrasions on their arms and shoulders, which experts attributed to frequent physical contact. The teenager's diary entries for the first week of August reveal a complete blurring of his notions of family. He wrote of home as a world without rules and of a person who needs to be protected from others. These lines, according to a forensic psychologist, indicate the development of a shared delusional system in which both participants reinforce each other's mental disorder, eliminating external reference points. In Kevin's bedroom, where they spent almost all their time, the decor remained unchanged. Curtained windows, thick drapes, dim light from a table lamp, and the smell of damp fabric. Things were arranged symmetrically, suggesting an obsessive need for order. Experts noted that in the final days before the tragedy, the room began to resemble a refuge. Wax stains and burnt pieces of paper were found on the floor, likely an attempt at symbolic cleansing. The mother increasingly spent her nights in her car outside the house, avoiding going inside. According to neighbors, the light on the second floor remained on until dawn. Sometimes the door would open, and Aaron would emerge onto the porch, barefoot, with a blank expression. One neighbor, writing in his diary after the incident, described it as the feeling as if the house itself had begun to face the street. Psychiatrists analyzing the family's behavior based on the case materials noted signs of developing psychosis in both men. Kevin exhibited elements of paranoid thinking and dependence on a single source of emotional connection. The son showed signs of an identity merging with his father's. This phenomenon is called mirror symbiosis, when a teenager loses a sense of self, imitating the object of their affection down to the smallest details. Almost a week before the murder, Linda stopped going to work. Co-workers recalled her hands were scratched and her eyes were bloodshot. She attributed this to fatigue, but her voice became dry and monotonous. A doctor she saw shortly before the tragedy noted signs of severe emotional burnout. According to the court, it was during this period that her mental health began to fail. The case file reveals that Linda purchased a new set of kitchen knives 3 days before the murder. She would later explain to investigators that she wanted to replace the old ones because they were rusty. However, experts identified this as a subconscious act of premeditation. An air of menace gradually settled over the building. Neighbors noticed the windows had grown darker, as if the power had been cut off. The television no longer worked, and mail was piling up at the door. On the evening of August 14th, a resident reported a strong odor to the police, but the patrol found no signs of an emergency. The windows were closed, and the door remained unopened. The forensic report records that the house was completely isolated at the time of the murder. All phones were disconnected, and clocks were frozen at the same time, 2:47 a.m. Kevin's room had a fan pointing toward the wall, and a pile of torn photographs lay nearby. On one of the photographs, investigators would later discover a knife cut running through the image of his mother. This detail became symbolic. The boundaries between family members had completely disappeared. The internal conflict reached its peak. Each person lived within their own version of events. The mother felt threatened and ashamed. The father feared and dependent. The son fanatical devotion. The system in which all three existed without contact with the outside world became self-contained and unsustainable. By the night of August 16th, Linda was awake. The house's internal clock had become confused. According to experts, traces of coffee and uncollected dishes remained in the kitchen. Everything pointed to prolonged tension and a loss of sense of time. It was a state of extreme internal pressure where any action could trigger the fire. On the morning of August 17th, the 911 call rang out. Minutes after the house, plunged into silence for months, finally erupted. August 17th, 1994, began like an ordinary summer day. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the sun was rising over Cedar Ridge, and the streets were quiet. Neighbors recalled that, around 7 o'clock, a dull noise like the sound of a heavy object falling was heard coming from the Milton's house. No one paid it any attention. Sounds had long ceased to surprise them in this house. 2 hours later, a local resident noticed the door wide open and the Milton's dog running around the yard, growling at its own shadow. By this point, the house was already a scene of destruction. A table in the living room had been overturned, and brown stains covered the walls. Kitchen knives purchased a few days earlier lay scattered on the floor. According to experts, everything happened quickly, without preparation, but with extreme emotional intensity. Linda was in a state bordering on psychosis. A reconstruction of events based on forensic evidence shows that around 6:40 a.m., Linda was awakened by sounds in her son's room. From that moment on, events unfolded rapidly. She headed for the door and, upon opening it, was confronted with what she would later describe as an uncontrollable sight. She didn't recall the exact scene, only fragments, dim lights, breathing, a feeling of suffocation. Psychiatrists who analyzed her testimony noted a dissociative state, a detachment from reality. She went down to the kitchen, picked up the first knife she could find, and returned upstairs. The first blow was inflicted on the man standing closest to the door, the next on the teenager. According to the forensic examination, the actions were impulsive, with no intention of concealing the wounds. This is evidenced by the direction of the wounds, straight, frontal, with no attempt to evade. After the attack, the woman didn't run away. She went to the bathroom, washed her hands, and then returned to the room. The report states that she stood by the door for several minutes, showing no signs of panic. From that moment on, her automatic phase began, cleaning, moving objects, attempting to close the windows. Everything happened in complete silence. Even the dog, according to neighbors, didn't bark. The first officers to arrive on the scene noted a thick, musty odor in the house. The only light on was in the hallway. An open bottle of pills lay on the kitchen table, antidepressants prescribed to Linda several weeks before the incident. A mug with the remains of cold coffee stood nearby. Linda was sitting in a chair, her elbows resting on her knees. Her hands were shaking, but her gaze remained fixed. She did not answer questions about what had happened. Experts noted no signs of a struggle. The actions were sudden but deliberate. There were no signs of forced entry in the house, and nothing was stolen. All windows and doors were locked from the inside. This confirmed the theory that the crime was committed by a family member. Psychologists who analyzed the case noted that the murder coincided with the culmination of a long period of psychological breakdown. Emotional conflicts, guilt, and disgust had been building in the house for months. By the time of the tragedy, Linda was in a state of extreme tension, her moral barriers completely shattered. One report stated, "This is not a crime of malice, it is a mental collapse." According to forensic experts, Linda made no suicide attempt after the fatal wounds were inflicted, ruling out despair as a motive. Most likely, her actions were a form of forced cleansing, the destruction of what she perceived as a source of shame. This is supported by her behavior after the crime. She carefully closed the doors, folded her things, and wiped the table. No signs of chaos, other than traces of blood, were found. The first officers to arrive described the woman as looking exhausted and unresponsive. There were no tears on her face, only traces of fatigue. When asked why she had done what she had done, she uttered a short sentence that became part of the case file. "I just wanted it to be over." That day, Cedar Ridge found itself in the spotlight of national media for the first time in decades. Police cordons, journalists, and forensic experts appeared on the narrow street where children's bicycles had been parked just the day before. The small house at number 74 became a subject of scrutiny, every inch a reminder of the disintegration of a family that had gone from silent coexistence to mutual destruction. By evening that same day, Kevin and Aaron's bodies were taken to the county lab. Dozens of residents gathered outside. Some whispered prayers, others remained silent. The house was sealed. A sign hung on the door, "Family incident, access restricted." Inside, everything remained as it had been at the time of the crime. The smell of coffee, an overturned chair, and a frozen silence that would never again be broken by the voices of this family. The investigation began that same day. The Monroe County investigative team, led by Detective John Whitmore, arrived on the scene. Within the first few hours, it became clear that the crime was strictly a family affair. Only Linda Milton's fingerprints were found on the knives. Forensic experts determined that the blows were inflicted sequentially, with minimal intervals, ruling out the involvement of others. Linda was detained without resistance. During her initial interrogation, she showed no emotion, spoke monotonously, and avoided pronouns, referring to the victims as they. For the first 2 days, she refused food and did not ask questions about her children. Forensic psychiatrists recorded signs of profound dissociation and emotional numbness. The district attorney filed a charge of double first-degree murder. However, the defense insisted on including a diagnosis of acute reactive psychotic state. During the investigation, a series of psychological evaluations were conducted. The results confirmed that at the time of the crime, Linda was in a state of temporary mental disorder caused by prolonged stress and mental exhaustion. The trial began on June 12, 1995. It lasted 8 days. Excerpts from the son's diary, fragments of medical reports, and photographs from the home were read aloud. The courtroom was almost empty. The father's relatives refused to attend, stating that this story defies explanation. The prosecutor sought a life sentence, while the defense requested a declaration of insanity. Following the hearing, the court ruled that Linda Milton was sane but committed the crime while in a severe mental crisis. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison without parole. She began serving her sentence in the Marion County Women's Prison, where she was placed under psychiatric supervision. According to reports from 1999, Linda remained stable but showed no signs of remorse. Their daughter, 9-year-old Emily, was placed in the care of her aunt. She later changed her surname. Her name does not appear in official records. The family home on West Deer Lane was demolished in 2002 after several years of vacancy. The Milton case became a topic of discussion in medical and criminological publications. It was viewed as an example of a combination of mental isolation, family dysfunction, and loss of social connections. FBI reports classified the case under the category of intrafamilial collapse.